If you have an issue with ovulation, it means that your body has decided that this is not a good time to procreate. It means that your body is actually potentially protecting you.
Welcome to Get Pregnant Naturally, where functional medicine and natural fertility solutions will help you get pregnant and have your baby. Hey there, I'm Sarah Clark, and my mission is to inspire, motivate, and empower you. And most of all, I want you to wake up. So with functional medicine, we can discover what causes infertility and eventually reverse the condition. Today, I'm welcoming Lisa Hendrickson-Jack to the podcast. And so I connected with Lisa about 2 years ago when I was featured on her Fertility Friday podcast. So check out my story in episode number 40. So, I love Lisa's natural approach to fertility and her passion to educate women, specifically the impact of the birth control pill and what their menstrual cycle is trying to tell them. So I'm going to give a little bio here about Lisa. So Lisa is a fertility awareness educator and a holistic reproductive health practitioner who has been charting her own menstrual cycles using the Fertility Awareness Method for the past 15 years. So she's passionate about helping women to develop body literacy by understanding their natural cycles. So Lisa struggled with excessively heavy and painful periods for years, and then she discovered the connection between health and fertility firsthand. So her personal experience of overcoming Hashimoto's diagnosis and uterine fibroids has influenced her practice immensely. So she created her weekly radio show, Fertility Friday podcast, so definitely check that out, to connect with women with a deeper understanding of how fertility and overall health are connected and intertwined with their menstrual cycle. The number one response from her listeners is always, why don't they teach this stuff when we were growing up? Yeah, definitely. Her mission is to share the message of body literacy with as many women as possible. So each week she conducts in-depth interviews with professionals who specialize in helping women to restore their fertility naturally. So check her out at fertilityfriday.com. So welcome to the podcast, Lisa.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, awesome. So, you know what? I find most people that, that do this work have, and we sort of talked about this in the bio a little bit, but can you share how you came to help people with, using the fertility awareness method?
Yes. My story is, I think my story is an interesting one because it's not really the common, like the way things commonly are these days. I discovered the fertility awareness method when I was about 18 or 19 years old. So I was really, really young at the time. And in my case, because I had such painful, heavy periods when I was a teenager in high school and things, and I was really active. I played sports. I was on the track team and I was on the basketball team and all that. And so, kind of interfered with it was cramping my style. I didn't mean for the pun, but it came out. And so I was put on the pill at about age 16, just so that I could manage that. And when I actually needed birth control, so when I became sexually active, I didn't feel comfortable with the pill because since I had been taking it for the purpose of getting rid of my cramps and lightening my periods, I was never taking it at the same time. Like I would forget it half the time and all of that. So I felt like if I was taking it for birth control, I would always be scared that I was pregnant. So I feel like I'm kind of the opposite of most women. And so I was looking for a different type of birth control. So initially I thought, okay, let me just use condoms. And then I discovered the fertility awareness method and I was like, oh, wow. So it blew my mind because I realized that there's only a short window of fertility each month in your cycle. And so I have used that method to prevent pregnancy for the majority of my adult life. I do have 2 children that were excessively planned. So other than the 6 months, if you add it together, that I spent trying to conceive, other than that, I've always used it for birth control. So the reason that I do this work now is because when I got into my 30s and I started having kids, I realized that most of the women in my life, pretty much all of them, had no idea how their fertility worked. Mm-hmm. And I also saw a lot of women struggling with fertility. And I felt like here I am sitting on all this information. I know exactly what's happening in my cycle. And most women have no idea. So I felt compelled to share. And that's why I do this now.
No, that's amazing. It's amazing. So yeah, let's dig into exactly what the fertility awareness method is.
Well, in a nutshell, the fertility awareness method allows you to identify which parts of your cycle you can get pregnant and which parts of your cycle that can't. the thing is that we're all taught, I imagine that all of the women listening were also taught that you can get pregnant on every single day of your cycle. Mm-hmm. So I remember being told that there were no safe days and all of the days you could get pregnant. And it turns out that there's only about 6 days of the cycle where you can actually get pregnant. The rest of the time you can't get pregnant. It's actually men that make the sperm all the time. They have the sperm every day. And so men are fertile all the time, but we are not. And basically the Fertility Awareness Method allows you to monitor your fertile signs. So the 3 main signs are your cervical mucus. For a lot of women, they might, we're never taught about cervical mucus. And so a lot of women may have experienced it, but didn't know what it was. So if anyone's listening and they ever thought that they were getting like recurring yeast infections because they were always like wet and they always had this discharge for a certain period of time in their cycle. There's a lot of women who have ended up in their doctor's office every month and they keep getting like the tests are negative. And so they still think that they have an infection. Or if you've ever had the experience where you're sure that you had your period, like you're sure that your period started because you felt that wetness and then you went to the bathroom and there was nothing there. So if you've ever had an experience like that, you've, interacted with your mucus, but you probably just didn't know the mucus. Mm-hmm. So you only produce mucus during your fertile window. Like you produce this mucus and it looks like, it can look like raw egg whites. It can look like creamy white hand lotion. It can feel quite wet. And when you're wiping yourself, when you go to the bathroom, it can feel quite slippery. And so you only produce that fluid as you approach ovulation. And so when you have that fluid is what allows the sperm to survive in your body for up to 5 days. And that is what makes you fertile. So that's the first sign of fertility that we would pay attention to. The second is your basal body temperature. So after you ovulate, your temperature actually increases in a measurable way that you can plot on a graph. So you can actually use your temperature to confirm that you've ovulated in your cycle. And then the third is cervical position. So your cervix actually changes position when you're in your fertile window, and then it changes position again after ovulation. And all of these changes are related to your hormone levels. So your rising levels of estrogen and progesterone throughout your cycle. So even though we weren't taught this, it's basic biology, it's scientifically validated, and it's not the rhythm method. It's something completely different. And any woman can learn it, and you can actually then, if you want to, use it as a method of birth control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the cervical mucus takes a little bit of, I guess, a couple cycles to figure out, right, to understand what it's telling. Can you maybe dig into that a little bit for us?
Yeah, well, I mean, with cervical mucus, from a very basic standpoint, if you see it, if you observe it, if you have it, you're fertile, and if you don't have it, you're not. But there's a difference between being generally aware of your body signs versus actually using a method of birth control. So with regards to fertility awareness, there are a lot of different resources, there are a lot of different organizations, and there's a lot of different methodologies for how to chart the mucus and how to check for it and how to interpret it so you can understand when you're fertile. So I think, the main thing, even if you never want to use this method as a birth control or anything like that, the basic knowledge every woman should have, and we can all have that general understanding of our mucus, I think. But in terms of using it for a method, yes, like you would have to take some time to learn how to chart it, how to check for it, and how to interpret it. There's different types of mucus. Like I mentioned, sometimes your mucus will look like raw egg whites, like it'll be really stretchy and clear, and you can actually like pick it up and like stretch it between your fingers. Sometimes it looks like creamy white hand lotion. So if you think about putting some hand lotion between your fingers and rubbing it together, both of those types of mucus you can conceive if you have them. But then there's what happens when you start charting is you can start paying attention to other things. So I'll just give you an example, Sarah. I have a number of clients who, through charting their cycles, have identified that they have different, they have cervical infections or cervical dysplasia. And there are women who have been able to use charting to, identify early stages of cervical cancer so that they can, obviously that's a really big deal. Mm-hmm. So, in addition to mucus, there are other types of things that you might be observing, and that can make it a bit complicated, especially if you're just starting out. So it's really helpful to have some support if you actually really want to use this method as birth control and feel really confident in using it that way.
Yeah, and then if they're trying to conceive, so you're sort of the ones that they're looking for stretchy, clear, or kind of that hand lotion consistency for.
Yes.
Yeah. Which
what I didn't even mention.
It's kind of gross, but
But what I didn't mention, Sarah, was how you can use it for conception. So for all the women who are listening to your podcast and who are wanting to know, okay, so then can I use this to help me conceive? The best days to have sex when you're trying to have a baby are the days that you have cervical mucus present. So a lot of women will look for all these different signs or try to have sex on day 14 of their cycle when day 14 could have nothing to do with when they ovulate. So your cervical mucus should actually be the primary sign that you're looking for when you're trying to conceive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it takes out the guesswork, but it does take a couple cycles to understand kind of this, to see, I guess, to understand the cervical mucus though.
Definitely.
Right?
Yeah.
Then kind of maybe like a lot of women come to me here and probably to you as well with, what's a normal period?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I think right off the bat, one of the first things that comes to mind is that we often think of our menstrual cycle as our period. And we're taught that our period is kind of the only thing that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first day of your menstrual cycle is the first day of your period. And so your menstrual cycle is, all the days from the beginning of your period to the day before you start your next one. So that's just something in general. I'll tell you about what a normal period is. I just want to have that idea that it's your whole menstrual cycle that we want to look at. And in addition to your period, you can actually learn a lot from what a healthy menstrual cycle overall should look like. But in terms of a normal period lasts anywhere from about 3 to 7 days. That's the range, with an average of about 4 to 5 days. And you would expect the flow in a normal period to be red, a variant of red. Mm-hmm. So you can think of wine or brighter red, but we would expect it to be red. And then when your period begins, we would expect it to start. So if you think about your period like a sentence, like it begins. We don't just kind of trail into it. So it begins, and also there's a pattern of bleeding that would follow like a crescendo, decrescendo, meaning that your period we would expect it to start moderate to heavy and actually then gradually decrease. So starting moderate to heavy and then kind of gradually tapering off. So it would be normal then for during the first 2 to 3 days of your period for you to lose the majority of the blood that you're going to lose, meaning that those days are typically the heaviest. So days 1 through 3 is where you lose like 90% of your the total blood loss in your menses. And we would expect when you're for your period to come to an end. So in the sentence example, like full stop. So you may have a day or two of kind of lighter bleeding as your flow tapers off, but we wouldn't expect it to trail on and on and on and have several days of post-menstrual bleeding, essentially post-menstrual spotting. Mm-hmm. And one of the questions I get the most is how much bleeding should I have? Like how much is normal?
Right.
And I think that often we think about periods, when we hear about periods, we think, okay, so it's a problem if it's really heavy, but we don't always have that awareness that it could be a problem if it's too light. So your average menstrual cycle falls somewhere between, say, 35 to 45 milliliters. On the really low end, we would expect the total bleeding to fall somewhere between between an ounce and, say, 5 ounces. Mm-hmm. So up to about 80 milliliters of bleeding is considered to be normal. Less than, say, 25 milliliters over the course of your whole period would be considered too light.
Which is 2 to 3 ounces, I guess, is that?
Yeah, so if the whole time you have a period, it's less than 1 ounce of bleeding, mm-hmm. then yeah, that would be a problem. And so the reason that they cut it off at 80 milliliters in terms of the top end is because if you do regularly have more than 80 milliliters of bleeding, you're more likely to have signs of anemia, like iron deficiency anemia, and it may also be related to a different condition. So, for instance, like fibroids or adenomyosis or something like that. So if it's over 80 milliliters consistently, you may want to actually check that out.
Yeah, I remember in my teens when my period started, it was going irregular and it was like really heavy. And then I'd literally when it would come, I remember having to put my head between my knees. I thought I was going to faint every month, just I guess losing so much blood.
Well, and it's interesting because it makes sense to think, okay, if I'm losing all that blood, then I'm going to develop an iron deficiency. But what's interesting is that there's also an inverse relationship there. So if you are deficient in iron, you're more likely to bleed more.
Yeah, vicious cycle. Yeah. And then I guess with some of the symptoms, because so many women are, when I had my period, yeah, horrible cramps and heavy bleeding, and I remember lying in bed going, what the heck's going on? But yeah, so what would be a quote unquote normal?
That's such a good question because we're taught in a way that it's normal to have pain and to have painful cramps. Like that's just a part of being a woman and that's just how it is. And so although it's really common to have pain with menstruation, a lot of women do experience it, it is not normal. And when you do have excessive pain with menstruation, it is actually considered a problem and it can be an important indicator of an underlying condition. And so what's considered normal would be basically your period coming and going with very little fuss, minimal to no cramping. So the challenge is that there's a lot of women that do experience some degree of pain with menstruation. And so it's really helpful to kind of quantify it. If you have to take an Advil or something, then if it's such that you can't go to work, if you like, you know what I mean? Like if it interferes with your day,
Mm-hmm.
but if you actually have to take pain medication for it, then that is not normal. It's very common, but it's not normal.
Yeah, a sign to look deeper.
Yeah, and it's with period pain. It's related often to inflammation, and it can have a lot to do with the way that we eat, like the foods that we consume, exposure to xenoestrogens. If we're cooking with olive oil, I mean, olive oil is actually not the worst. Olive oil can withstand some heat, but it does have a fairly low smoke point. Right. And so even if you're cooking with canola oil or other types of vegetable oils that have a low smoke point, when you're consuming those oils, often they're damaged. They can incorporate into your cells, leading to inflammation, and that can contribute to period pain. So there's a lot of different. It can also be related to nutrient deficiencies and different things. And then I guess on the other end, if a woman has excessively painful periods, it can be a sign that she may have endometriosis. And there was a study that came out showing that, on average, your North American woman may have signs of endometriosis and extremely painful periods for anywhere from 8 to 9 years before she ever receives a diagnosis. So it's really important as women for us to know and recognize that pain is not normal, because our practitioners aren't always taking it seriously and aren't always doing that investigative work to see if there could actually be a problem, an underlying issue.
Yeah, and a lot of time it'll be like, oh, let's go on the pill, instead of digging further into what exactly is the issue. I've had this with my daughter and her friend, and a number of her friends as well, where they're having, there's period issues, and the first thing that the doctor does is put them on the birth control pill.
Well, and in my case is exactly like that. And I mean, yeah, the pill took the pain away. But for me, what really got on my radar was that, sometimes I would just go off of it because I was a teenager. And so I wasn't very consistent. And as soon as I went off of it, my periods would come back with a vengeance.
That's right.
And so I knew that it wasn't actually fixing anything. So I very much knew from a very early age, that this thing that I was taking wasn't actually doing anything. And I always was a little bit afraid because I thought, this isn't normal to have all this pain. And I was worried that if I didn't figure out what was causing it, I might not be able to have kids someday. So even at a very young age, I remember being really nervous about this whole thing. And that was part of the reason that I chose the path that I did. And so now, many years later, my periods come and go with no pain. And to put it into perspective for the women listening, when I used to have period pain, it was so bad that I couldn't do anything if I didn't take my Advil in that window. So if anyone who's listening has period pain, Sarah, you probably know about the window. Mm-hmm. If you don't take the drugs within like 20 minutes or 5-10 minutes of the pain starting, then your whole day is destroyed. And so, in fact, when I went into labor with my first son, I was in labor all day and I didn't even know because I was like, this can't be labor. My period pain is worse than this. So yeah, it was really, really, really bad. And I've spoken to a number of practitioners who look back and they say, I don't know, man, you may have had some early stages of endometriosis because the way you describe your pain is really bad. But I just want to give some hope. It is possible to manage period pain without drugs, but you may have to actually seek support from a trained practitioner who's knowledgeable in that field. Acupuncture has been shown to be extremely helpful in managing the pain of endometriosis and period pain in general, because those two things are not the same thing. Functional practitioners such as naturopaths and, different areas, they're able to support you in actually, supporting the body to reduce the inflammation and to reduce the prostaglandins that are associated with causing the contractions that cause the pain and all those types of things. So there's a lot of ways to treat menstrual pain without resorting to the pill as a Band-Aid to kind of cover it up.
Yeah, and if you're trying to get pregnant, it's a sign that we use functional testing to look at, like looking at food sensitivity testing, using the Dutch hormone test, looking at your hormone levels, and then a lot of people we work with, we use stool testing, and parasites, fungal infections, bacterial infections comes back. So there's a reason that it's off. So it's like to dig further using the tools of functional medicine.
Well, and there's so many possible there's so many possible factors that can contribute to period pain. And so you can really address a lot of those factors in holistic ways, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And so even one interesting reason behind menstrual pain for some women. So if you did have a condition like endometriosis or something like that, one of the characteristics is that you can form these adhesions inside of your body. And what an adhesion is kind of like where two things stick to each other. So you have, maybe you have an organ that's supposed to have freedom of motion, but because of this adhesion, it's actually sticking to somewhere else. So your uterus, I think what's interesting when I'm teaching fertility awareness in the different, classes that I teach in my one-on-one sessions with clients, I show them how the uterus moves throughout the menstrual cycle. So the whole uterus actually kind of moves around throughout your menstrual cycle. And so when you're in your fertile window, your uterus will kind of stand, if you can picture a uterus, it's kind of like standing up, like right on. And then after you finish ovulating, your uterus kind of like drops back down, like kind of lays back down. I'm doing it with my hand, but that doesn't help anyone who's listening. But what I'm trying to say, like the point is that your uterus actually moves around. And a really amazing example of this, I did an interview with an amazing woman named Rachel Eyre, and she described what she called the kind of the dancing uterus or the dancing fallopian tube. But basically, she's a fertility massage therapist, and she has worked with clients to help to remove some of the adhesions so that the uterus can have the freedom and range of motion that it's supposed to have. And in one of the examples, she was working with a client who had lost one of her fallopian tubes via ectopic pregnancy, or she had a blocked tube. But either way, one of her tubes was not functional. And so, after a couple months working with this woman, she did conceive. And when they looked at the ultrasound, they looked at everything that had taken place, they discovered that the ovary on the one side had ovulated, and it was the fallopian tube on the other side that had moved around and caught the egg. Because when you ovulate into your abdominal cavity. It's kind of like you ovulate into Never Never Land, and the fallopian tube that's attached to your uterus, it actually kind of catches the egg. And so I like to share that example because it gives you this idea of, wow, like your uterus actually moves around. It needs to have freedom of motion. So for some women, for many women, they may be experiencing pain because their uterus doesn't have that ability to move because of these adhesions that can be broken up not only through surgery, but you can also use abdominal massage therapies such as RVGO therapy or fertility massage therapy or Mercier therapy. There's a lot of different uterine massage modalities that can actually help to improve alignment, reduce adhesions, and ultimately reduce your pain. It doesn't, you know what I mean? Like there's all these different options that we just have never been taught about.
Absolutely. Yeah, I did an interview, and you've done an interview, I think, with the founder of the RVGO Massage, so ARVI.
Rosita RVGO?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I interviewed a practitioner in the Toronto area, and she was telling me on people that she'd work with, and basically, yeah, it's an actual fertility massage. So they're trained practitioners. So it's ARVIGO. And you can check out the blog on my website. And also Lisa on on her podcast has interviewed. What is her name?
Rosita RVGO. Yeah, it was fascinating.
Yeah.
To say the least.
Awesome. So let's kind of dig into some specific, if someone has irregular cycles, is there any way, I don't know, it's hard to diagnose, but like what would you, or not diagnose, but what do you think would be, what were some things you would look at if someone has irregular cycles, kind of using that fertility awareness method? What's kind of like a thing that pops up?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that we'd want to define what an irregular cycle is. So the word irregular cycle is thrown around, and many women believe that their cycles are irregular if they are anything other than 28 days. So, a lot of women I've spoken to have menstrual cycles that are, say, 30 days long, and they'll say, oh, my cycles are irregular because they're not 28 days. So basically, the myth that every woman has a 28-day cycle, that's all it is. It's a myth. What's helpful to know, just as we kind of talked about what a normal period is, a normal menstrual cycle can vary and be anywhere between about 25 and 35 days. So you would want the cycle length to be kind of closer to that like 29, 30 day range. But ultimately, if it's within that about 25 to 35 day range, then it still falls within the normal parameters. Okay. And so what's normal in a menstrual cycle is to have some variation. So what's considered normal is if your cycle does fall within that range, and then from cycle to cycle, it's not really varying more than 8 days a cycle. So if you had a cycle 1 month and it was 27 days long, and then you had a cycle the next month and it was 32 days long, and then the following month it was 29 days long, that wouldn't be considered irregular. That would just be normal fluctuation, provided that all the other parameters were in line. So what we would really consider to be irregular is if the cycle is varying quite a bit. So if we have one cycle, you have 21 days, the next cycle it's 45. The next cycle it's 31, the next cycle it's 52. So just so that we're clear on what is the result of an irregular cycle. And so one of the interesting things that I teach and that I talk about on my podcast a lot is that when you pay close attention to the menstrual cycle, and when you're working with someone who actually knows how to read and interpret what's happening in your menstrual cycle, you can actually utilize your cycle as a diagnostic tool to learn about what's happening in your body, because your menstrual cycle is a reflection of what's happening in your overall health. So it really depends on what's happening with that particular woman. So you can have a woman, for example, who has fairly consistent cycles, and she has one cycle that's totally off. Maybe it's like, a whole week or 10 days longer than usual. And then when you talk to her, you may find that, that week her sister was getting married and she had to travel, halfway around the world, and all of these things were going on. And potentially those stressors delayed ovulation and then caused her cycle to be a bit longer that month. So, for instance, in that case, would we say that she has irregular cycles? Well, I wouldn't. I would say that she had a normal reaction to the stressors of her life that month. And then you may have another woman who, when you look at her cycle parameters, there's a lot of different ways that you can gauge what's normal in a cycle. So one of those ways is, when ovulation happens in the cycle, if it's delayed, what her cervical mucus patterns are like, what her basal body temperatures are, just all of these, and what her luteal phase is like, how long it is, if she's having bleeding when she's not supposed to be bleeding, those types of things. So when you have a woman that has really irregular cycles, like legitimately irregular, depending on what we're seeing on the cycle, it can indicate a lot of different things. So she may have an underlying thyroid issue. She may have issues with adrenals. She may actually have food sensitivities. She may have gut issues. So, if you have really, severe gut issues where you have symptoms like irritable bowel symptoms or some sort of gut infection, when you're consuming those foods that, are triggering these responses, it can cause a lot of inflammation, which can, mess with your hormones, raising your cortisol levels, lowering your other hormone levels, and that can result in a delayed ovulation. Like, there's just so many different scenarios. A woman could have polycystic ovarian syndrome where she, is not sensitive to insulin and her ovaries are not responding to follicle stimulating hormone. Like, there could be just all these different things. So you take the chart and you take the cycle. You also take the history and the information, what has happened in this woman's life, what's currently going on. And with those two things combined, you can really support her in getting to the root of what's going on in her health and her fertility, and help her to kind of figure this all out. As opposed to our Western approach, Sarah, which is like, oh, just go take the pill, and then your cycle will be totally normal, which is not actually a thing.
or just march off to the fertility clinic and everything will be fine. And
we'll just make you ovulate. It's okay. Yeah. It's okay that you only ovulate every 60 days. We'll just make you ovulate. We'll give you some ovulatory drugs.
That's right. I know. And, IVF, the success rate, 30%, IUI, 10%, donor eggs, 20%.
depending
Yeah,
depending
like
on
the
your
average.
age.
Yeah,
Yeah, because IUI is one of those things that I have a really hard time with, because the research, it's like it's 15% if you're 21, and the success rate is more like 5% or
yeah,
3% if you're 42.
it's craziness. And
Yeah,
it's a lot of money.
a lot
And
of money.
yeah, and wait a minute, your cycle's irregular, like you said, thyroid, adrenals, gut health, food sensitivities. Like there's things to do where you can get to the root cause and figure out what's going on. And the magic pill being whatever it is, it may be it's seemingly easier path, but um, it's your health and then the health of your children, and it just affects generations of generations, kind of that epigenetics thing. So it's important to step back, and that's why you do what I do, you do what you do as far as educating, and same with me. It's basically educating women to know that there's things they can do, and it's empowering.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so regular cycles, and then what about like light periods? What would you, is the
Yeah,
same
so
kind of scenario then, where we dig further, or what would a light period say to you?
well, I think that I bring everything back to the fundamentals when I'm talking about the menstrual cycle and fertility and hormonal health. And so the first thing I think of is we have to think about, what is your period? Your period is a printout of what happened hormonally that month. And so if you think about, where does your period come from? So your period is your period is your uterine lining shedding, right? So what builds your uterine lining? So in order to have a healthy, robust period, in the beginning of your cycle, your ovaries are producing estrogen, and estrogen is a hormone that causes things to grow. So under the influence of estrogen, a number of different changes take place, changes that we've spoken about. Our cervical mucus is produced in response to estrogen, but estrogen also triggers the uterine lining to grow. So, you have your period and it's kind of like you're starting fresh, everything was shed, and then it's estrogen that actually proliferates that lining and causes it to grow. And rapidly kind of grow after when you enter into your next cycle. And so your estrogen levels rise until you ovulate. So the high estrogen is what triggers ovulation to happen. And then after you ovulate, your ovaries start producing high levels of progesterone. So estrogen and progesterone have different roles. Estrogen causes the lining to grow, and progesterone causes the lining to mature. So progesterone is what directs the cells, tells them what to do, helps them grow up. And it also helps basically to increase the volume of the uterine lining, makes it like thick and fluffy. So if estrogen, I think of an analogy of like, if you buy a house, estrogen is the movers and it like throws everything in, and then progesterone is what actually unpacks everything and gets everything ready for the baby. Mm-hmm. And so when you have a really light period, the first thing I think of is hormones. Because if your period is super, super light, that's telling us something about your hormone levels. And typically when I'm looking at the menstrual cycle chart of a woman that has really light periods, it's not like everything else is totally fine and we have a light period.
Yeah, there's other typically,
yeah, like it's all connected. So what I would be looking for in her chart is I would be looking at her cervical mucus production, her cervical mucus pattern, her basal body temperatures. And I would also be looking to her and seeing what's going on in her life. I've worked with a lot of clients that have had really light periods, and often there's some sort of thing going on. So whether that is that their body is literally fighting an infection right now, like there's an underlying infection that they've identified, and so we know that their body is under stress, whether they are literally under stress and they have the most stressful job ever and things are going on, whether there's signs of a potential thyroid disorder on the chart, like there's just, nothing happens in isolation. So, and then we'd also have to define what light is. And so as we talked about before, a light period, if your period is less than 3 days and you have barely any bleeding, first of all, we'd want to establish that that's actually a period and not potentially ovulatory spotting or anovulatory bleeding. Like if you're charting your cycles, you would know if you ovulated, you would see the temperature shift, you would see your cervical mucus dry up. So you would know if your period, you start bleeding about 12 days later, you would know that that's your period. But sometimes you may have bleeding that is not your period. And if you're not charting, you may just think you have a really light period, but maybe that's not your period. So there's all these things that we'd have to look into. But basically, the first thing I think of is hormones. Do you have a sufficient hormone production happening.
Yeah. And then with a heavy period, which you experienced and I experienced, for me, it was something different. You, it was something different.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends. So there's certain phases of your life where you're more likely to experience heavier bleeding. So it's more common for girls in their teens for their bleeding to be a little bit on the heavier side. And then sometimes during menopause, bleeding can be a little bit, or not during menopause, in the premenopausal years. Menopause means that there's no more periods. So in those premenopausal years, and that can be a result of estrogen, just higher levels of estrogen or unopposed estrogen. That can be one of the reasons. Like I mentioned, estrogen and progesterone have different roles. So if you're and in the cycle, if you think about it, so, your average cycle is still about 28 to 29 days, although there is some variation. And if you think about that, ovulation happens about in the middle. And so you're supposed to have about as many days of estrogen as progesterone. These are supposed to balance each other out. So it can be an indication of an issue with hormones. But you would also want to look at other factors. You would want to look at to see if you have super heavy periods, you want to check your iron. Like you just want to check your iron. And if you have a deficiency, you're going to want to start eating some liver, like to rectify it. And then also you'd want to, get yourself checked out, get an ultrasound. When I was really young, I had an ultrasound done because I had a family history of fibroids, and lo and behold, I had the fibroids. And so I have the heavy periods. So there's a lot of different things that can contribute to it. But I think, if you have really heavy, just check out the basics, iron level, get an ultrasound, just kind of make sure everything's okay.
Yeah, and the majority of people that we work with, there's a gut infection in there too, because if you've been trying to get pregnant for a number of years, like there's a reason. So either the food sensitivity came first, or was it the gut infection with the parasite, with which then stresses the adrenals, and then it just sort of all goes together. So and then affecting your cycle. So okay, so for light periods, heavy periods, again, yeah, you're investigating further. Ovulation issues. Anything you'd say about that?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of different factors that can, because what basically in your menstrual cycle, your pre-ovulatory phase is the most variable. So the myth is that, we all ovulate on day 14 all the time, and everything is based on that. Most women don't ovulate on day 14 most, if not all of the time. And so that's just something to be aware of. So ovulation is highly variable. And if you take a moment to imagine that your body is actually intelligent, then if you think about it from that perspective, if you have an issue with ovulation, it means that your body has decided that this is not a good time to procreate. It means that your body is actually potentially protecting you.
That's right. Survival comes first before conception, right? Yeah.
That's right. And so in the example that I gave before of, the woman who's super stressed and, but in a good way, because her sister's getting married, and then, her ovulation is delayed by a week. Well, I see that all the time. And one of the things that happens when I'm doing my groups, so when I'm doing this type of work, is that, the women that I'm working with are often really surprised because of how sensitive their cycles are to what's happening in their lives. So that's just kind of a preface, just to think about that way. But we often think of stress as like the boss yelling at you, or like the traffic jam. We don't think of stress as having a gut infection and eating the food that you're totally allergic to or sensitive to. And so, I've worked with clients that have, whether it's chronic underlying infections, gut infections, like, SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, up and like even clients who are dealing with severe irritable bowel or Crohn's or something like that. And if you think about it from that, like when you are consuming, like if you have let's just throw gluten under the bus for a minute. So if you have a severe kind of sensitivity to bread or to wheat, for example, and you consume it and it causes you to have GI distress. And as you mentioned, Sarah, that causes a lot of inflammation. It causes an increase of cortisol and all those types of things. All of those situations in the body have an effect on the ovaries and basically cause the ovaries to be less sensitive to to the to follicle stimulating hormones. So the reason we ovulate, like all of these things happen in response to these hormonal cycles that happen. And so when it's time to ovulate, put in the most simple way, your brain tells your ovaries that it's time to ovulate. If there's all these other stressors going around and basically the world is crashing down beside your ovaries, they're not listening to the message. So for women who are struggling with fertility challenges, maybe they go to their doctor, they have all these testing done, and oh my goodness, my FSH is so high. How do I lower my FSH? Well, if you think about it, what's happening there is that your ovaries are not responding to what's happening. And ultimately, there's typically a reason why. So those are some examples. Ovaries are also, in order to have proper ovulatory function, there's a lot of different nutrients that we require for that to happen. So we need to have sufficient levels of all of the nutrients from vitamin A to iodine, which are, specifically implicated in ovarian function. And so there's a lot of different, there's just a lot of things that need to be in place. So ultimately, focusing on having a really hormone boosting diet, focusing on addressing any underlying infections, underlying food sensitivities, thyroid issues, adrenal stuff, like doing the basic stuff first, you're really getting out of your body's way. And you can go a long way to support your body's normal process of ovulation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, really getting honest about those, the mental and emotional stressors, the structural stressors. Maybe you have like something that's out of alignment in your body, the environmental toxins, like you talked about the xenoestrogens and things like that. So your cleaning chemicals, your personal care, like it could seem a lot, but it's like this layering process where you slowly look at all these things, and in a short period of time you can make major change. But yeah, let's dig into the birth control pill. This is a favorite topic of yours. We could probably go on forever, but maybe what are some top tips you think that could help if someone has been on the birth control pill, they've come off and they're ready to get pregnant, and now their period's not coming. So is there anything you can think of, some tips to restore the period? It's probably a massive topic, but
it is a pretty massive topic. I would say that you don't want to wait until after you come off of the pill to start thinking about how to optimize your cycle. And the reason I say that is because, statistically speaking, there's research that shows that the pill does cause a temporary delay in the return of your normal fertility. So it's not a permanent thing, but this is a significant issue for women. There's one study that I looked at where they actually measured the menstrual cycle parameters. So they looked at cycle length, they looked at the length of the luteal phase, so post-ovulatory phase. They measured all these different factors, and they compared a group of women who had just come off of various birth control methods, including the pill, to women who had never been on hormonal contraceptives. And on average, it took about 9 to 12 cycles before the menstrual cycle parameters evened out. So before the women who were coming off of the hormones, before their cycles looked like the women who had never been on the hormones. So 9 to 12 cycles is not 9 to 12 months, because it could take several weeks or months for your period to come back in the first place. So 9 to 12 cycles could be anywhere from 9 to 18 months or more. Mm-hmm. Just to put that into perspective. And another study that I was looking at, it measured the time to pregnancy coming off of hormonal birth control. And it defined long-term birth control users as women who used birth control for 2 years or more. And so in that study, women who came off the pill, on average, it took them 8 months to conceive, whereas women who were not taking hormonal birth control, on average, it took 4 months to conceive. So right off the bat, it took the women twice as long to conceive if they were coming off of the pill. And it's different if it's the shot, like the depot shot or something. Right. That was an average of 16 months. So the first thing to know, and this is something that I feel quite strongly about, is that as women, we're not taught that there's a delay in the return of normal fertility. And so we have been taught that we can get pregnant any day of the week. Pregnancy is a given, it's inevitable. We can get pregnant on every day of our cycles. Like, this is what we're taught. And so yes. I find, I've spoken to so many women in their late 30s who are just as afraid, or mid 30s, just as afraid of getting pregnant, like if they were to go off the pill, as they were when they were 21. Mm-hmm. we have this temporary effect of fertility with the pill, we also have your age. So the first thing I would say is, if you're planning to conceive, if you have the ability to come off of the hormonal birth control in advance, I would say that would be the first thing. So the way I see it is that ideally you would be coming off of the birth control at least 2 years, a year or two, but I'm just saying ideal here, before you even plan to try to start conceiving. And the reason that I say that is because, since we know that there's this temporary delay in the return of, and it doesn't mean everybody experiences it. We all know that some women come off the pill and they get pregnant right away. Right. So, we can't generalize here.
People that come to see us are struggling with fertility. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, and ultimately it's like buying insurance. Like, you buy insurance and you hope for the best. Like, you plan for the worst, you hope for the best, right? So I feel like this is buying insurance. So if you come off early, you allow your because one thing, even if you do conceive, your cycle is not, I have never seen a woman come off of hormonal birth control and her cycle is actually like fully within the parameters. So even if you do conceive, you're coming off of this pill. The pill's associated with nutrient deficiencies and different things. So either way, ideally you would want to come off early. Give your cycle just time to normalize, and also give yourself time to replenish those nutrients. So, if you're not in that boat and you don't have the luxury of doing that, you're already off of it and you're trying to conceive right now. What I would say is, it's kind of the fundamental things that Sarah and I have been talking about throughout the podcast. The hormonal birth control is associated with a number of different nutrient deficiencies. So specifically B vitamins like folate, B12, B6 in particular. Also, key nutrients like zinc and magnesium. There's just a number of different nutrients that have been shown to be depleted from hormonal birth control that are exacerbated with long-term use. And so, knowing that when you're coming off of hormonal birth control, you're going to want to spend some time replenishing those nutrients. And so, utilizing a nutrient-dense diet that contains, foods that are high in nutrition. So the top fertility foods that I often talk about are ancestral fertility foods, things like liver and organ meats, fish, foods that are high in zinc, since hormonal birth control depletes zinc, oysters, mussels like seafood, shellfish, if you can eat those kind of things, and also getting enough healthy fats, making sure that in order to produce hormones, so in order to make that progesterone and that estrogen, you need cholesterol, because cholesterol is the precursor for all of those hormones. And although your body can make, like your liver can make cholesterol, your liver has to do everything. Your liver is always working. So giving your body the fat that it needs through diet allows your body to make these hormones easier. So that's just like a piece, but really focusing on replenishing the nutrients that your body needs to build hormones, and also the nutrients that were depleted when you're on hormonal contraceptives. Really focusing on the fundamentals, getting enough sleep, identifying if there are any food sensitivities, if you do have any gut issues, paying close attention to your cycles, because start charting your cycles. Learn to identify which days in your cycle are fertile, which days are not, and learn what the basic fundamentals of a healthy cycle look like. Learn, how many days your cycle is supposed to be, how many days your luteal phase is supposed to be, and identify any cycle irregularities. If you have premenstrual spotting, like bleeding that happens several days before your period starts, if you have super low temperatures, like, just different things that can show up on your chart, then you're going to want to start looking into those things and addressing it, because all of those things can have an impact on your chances of conceiving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so really
go on, but I'm going to stop.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so really looking at your diet, looking at fats, bringing in those healthy fats, avocados, coconut oil. Yeah, so when you're talking about cooking with olive oil, cook with coconut oil, doesn't go rancid. It has a higher burn point.
And if you can tolerate it, cook with lard, cook with butter. Because then you're getting the, in addition to the cholesterol that helps you to build, so the cholesterol only comes from animal foods, to build those hormones, you're also getting fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. And vitamin A, for example, is critical for hormone production, ovulatory function, and fetal development. And so really thinking about the foods that are going to build your baby, that's really key.
And the gut health, because the pill can affect gut health. So then looking at gut repair, you could bring in collagen or bone broth, and yeah, bringing in and looking to see potentially if there is a gut issue going on, because you could be more susceptible to that. So investigating that further with looking at functional testing, but working on like a good probiotic, those sorts of things for gut. Yeah, so I guess so this is another big topic, and we'll just finish off with it. But so the different phases of the cycle, so menstruation, the follicular phase, ovulation, luteal phase. So maybe for each one, if you can kind of just say, how a woman would feel and what's good things to kind of do self-care wise during and diet, if you think, during this phase. So if we can start with menstruation.
Do you mind if I start with the follicular phase?
Yeah, you start where you want. Go for it.
I feel like it's easier to start there. I mean, if from kind of an energetic standpoint, for women who are cycling, we typically notice that we feel differently during different parts of our cycle. And so every woman isn't going to feel exactly the way I'm describing here, but it's helpful to know that certain parts of your cycle are associated with different feelings, different energy. And so in one of the interviews that I did an interview with Alexandra Pope and Shani Hugo Wurlitzer, and they're the authors of the book Wild Power. And in that interview, they shared the concept of, the different phases of the menstrual cycle, like the seasons of the year. And I think that that's a really great analogy for what's happening. So, the follicular phase, kind of like spring. So if you think about what's happening there, you just had your period and now everything's starting to grow again. And so many women will find that after they've kind of gone through menstruation, they have, their energy starts to come back, and they start feeling a bit more creative again and maybe a little bit more outgoing. So it's kind of like you're kind of starting fresh. Ovulation around that time is characterized by a heightened degree of creativity. And if you think about the metaphor that's happening, is you're ovulating, an egg is being released, and what could be more creative than creating a human life?
That's right.
So, that would be the summer, where you may find that you have more energy, feel more outgoing. And, as you approach ovulation, you're producing high amounts of estrogen, and, maybe your skin's glowing and you're feeling great. So that can, that's just something to think about during that time. I think in terms of what to do and how to take care of yourself during those times, like the follicular phase and ovulation, would really be to pay attention to how you feel. And I think that's the theme that runs through your whole menstrual cycle. If you're feeling energetic, if you're feeling creative, take advantage of that, go into that, and really utilize that time. And so after ovulation, you experience a hormonal shift. As I mentioned, your progesterone levels increase. And so this phase, the kind of luteal phase moving into menstruation, has been characterized as like the fall. So, the season of fall, where it's kind of like a winding down. And so many women would be able to relate to, as you approach menstruation, to feel potentially like you have a little bit less energy, particularly during the week before menstruation. Maybe you don't feel like you want to go out as much. You don't feel as social. You don't really feel like doing a bunch of stuff. And then some women do experience, symptoms that would be, so I think the one thing to say is that it is normal to experience some emotional changes, some mood changes throughout your cycle. And just by experiencing some changes, it doesn't mean that there's a problem. So we don't want to pathologize the normal cyclical nature of the menstrual cycle. I think that's really important. Mm-hmm. But, with that said, if it's particularly bad, if you have, mood swings that are particularly challenging, you want to pay attention to those things. And when you're charting your cycles during that time, you may notice certain signs of low hormone profile or an imbalance of estrogen and progesterone. And so it really depends on what's happening with that particular woman. In terms of taking care of yourself, I would say that listen to your body once again. If you feel, tired, and if you feel like you don't want to throw a big party for 100 people in your house, then you kind of want to pay attention to that and start tapping into your own energy and validating it, not thinking that you have to always be on and you have to always produce. If there's a couple of days of your cycle where you typically feel low energy, go with it and allow yourself to have that time. I think as we get older, like I know as I've gotten older, I just honor it more. I don't resist it. I don't try to like pretend like I'm always at the same like energetic level.
Yeah.
Like, you kind of just allow, like you give yourself permission to, and acknowledge that it's just a part of the cycle. Just like we have summer and winter, we have different phases of our cycle. And that's okay. So going into your period, that would be, the winter, that would be the metaphor there. But, during that time, it can be kind of a rough time, just depending, it can be a time where you typically don't feel super energetic and super outgoing. And one of the things that's really powerful that I found about the menstrual cycle is that there is a point in your cycle, it seems, where the different challenges and frustrations that you've had, whether it's in your life or that cycle, come up and they're brought to your attention. So, a lot of women will find that they maybe they feel a bit more emotional. Maybe their partner's breathing is going to bug them. I don't know, but you know what I mean? Like certain things that you tolerate all month long that kind of grate on you, really grate on you during that time. And I think that it's helpful to think about this experience as normal, as the cyclical experience of being a woman, as just a part of being a woman. And also, if you think about it as with the possibility that it has something to teach you. So from my personal experience, I have found that like if there was a guy that I was dating that really wasn't the guy for me, or if I had a job that I hated, or issues with friends or family, it was during that time that I couldn't ignore it. It was during that time that I would feel those feelings fully and I would get really annoyed. And it was because of that cyclical kind of like that, I call it like an internal secretary, like coming to throw all the crap on your desk. And I found that process, that cyclical process, always kept me in line with what I was supposed to be doing. Got me out of the relationship, got me out of the job, made sure I was on my path, made sure I focused on what I need to focus on. So that might have been a little more esoteric than you were thinking of, Sarah. But I feel like there's some validity in paying attention to your cycles. You have probably found this in your work, Sarah, but when I work with women and help them to connect with their menstrual cycle, what typically happens are things that you would never expect. All of a sudden, you have women who are thinking about, the bigger picture things in life, like, oh, I don't know if I should still be in this, position. I really don't like this job. I can see how the stress is affecting my menstrual cycle. Maybe I should, I always wanted to go back to school and do X. So now she's thinking about doing that. I've worked with women who they really wanted a baby when they came to me, and then they, through some work together, they kind of have this opportunity to really think about like, what are the reasons why I want to do this now? And like, what does this mean for my life? And they have all these different thoughts that come up. So there's some validity in just paying attention to what your body's saying. So that's kind of what I think about when I think of the winter. And that's why I didn't want to start there. I wanted to end there.
Yeah. No, it's like ultimately, listen, winter is coming. I'm deep into the Game of Thrones, only on season 3. So it's really each phase. So really the follicular is more, and follicular and the ovulation is kind of more energy and kind of doing some, I guess, more exercise, kind of faster paced things. And then whereas the luteal phase is kind of where you might be starting, your energy is kind of going down. You might be feeling a little crankier, and those moodiness things that you're talking about could hit, and cravings, which it's to some degree can be normal, as you've said. So it's like eating those really good, like a fertility diet, or you can take it one step further and do an anti-inflammatory diet. So just basically not eating processed foods would be the thing. And then when you're talking about menstruation, so really fully tune into what your body is saying, like, meditation or warm baths or things that to really slow down and really listen, as you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and the PMS conversation is a big one, and in terms of like this, like, so there's a researcher, Guy Abraham, and he he identified 4 different types of PMS. So you have PMS-A, which is anxiety, PMS-C, which is characterized by cravings, like sweet carbohydrate cravings to be specific, PMS-D that's characterized by depression, and PMS-H that's characterized by like hyperhydration, which is obviously like the bloating and those types of things. And so it doesn't mean that you're going to experience all, like if you experience one, it doesn't mean you're only going to experience one. Many women experience symptoms of all, but all of these signs, like, so if you actually have problematic symptoms during that luteal phase, it's often associated with issues with hormone balance, whether it's your progesterone's low, estrogen's too high, or whether your, liver function isn't operating optimally. So, your body has to break down and metabolize estrogens and different hormones. And so if it's not happening, optimally, that can contribute to this hormonal imbalance. Like there's lots of different reasons why a woman may have kind of out of control cravings and like experience depths of depression during that time. And if that's the case, again, supporting hormone production, finding ways to improve that progesterone, like estrogen balance during that phase by addressing whatever the issue is underlying, those are some of the things that you can do from a practical standpoint to address any problems. I just think it's helpful sometimes to not just say that your period is a problem. I think it's helpful to honor and acknowledge that there is some degree of mood changes and variation that is normal. But even when you have terrible symptoms, that is still a sign. That is still your body trying to communicate with you there's something wrong.
Yeah, it'll whisper, then it starts to shout, right? Yeah, it's yelling at you. Yeah. Okay, so I'm sure you've got lots of success stories. So maybe share one success story that comes to mind with someone you've worked with.
Well, I did work with a client who had been trying to conceive for quite some time. So when she came to me, she had been trying for about 2 years. And, as we started to work together, we really worked on identifying the fertile window. And as we kind of took a peek back at what was happening previous to our work together, even though she had been trying for 2 years, quote unquote, when we looked at her charts and, when the sex was actually happening in relation to her fertile window, it seemed as though, because that's one of the challenges when you're trying to conceive and you don't know how to identify your fertile window, and you're kind of basing it on like what the internet says and like you're having sex on day 14 and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes you miss the window.
Yeah.
You can miss it every month. Like sometimes by timing sex, you can miss the window. If you're timing it wrong. And so what we established was that even though she had felt like she was trying for all that time, there was only like, I could kind of count how many cycles that I would count as trying. So for me as a fertility awareness educator, you didn't really try if there's these 6 days that you can get pregnant, you have sex on those days. That's not a trial because you basically were using the method as birth control because you avoided the sex on the days. Anyway, so in her case, shortly after we began working together and we really nailed down the timing and we worked on a few other things that were showing up for her, she was able to conceive, and it was just this incredible experience because obviously it had been quite some time that her and her partner had been trying to conceive.
That's amazing. It's amazing. So maybe share with us a book or a website or an app, anything you would like to recommend to the listeners, something that you think is good.
I will humbly recommend my podcast, the Fertility Friday podcast.
Of course, yeah, you must listen to it.
So just because if you're interested in the Fertility Awareness Method, so if this conversation today has piqued your interest and you're like, oh my goodness, like there's so much about the menstrual cycle that I didn't know. When I started my podcast, it was the only one about fertility awareness. So I'm sure that there's others now, but I've been doing it for a while. So I've got like almost 200 episodes as we record this. So, it's a great resource. It's free. And there's so much information about the Fertility Awareness Method and fertility. In terms of books, there's a lot of really great books. The Fertility Awareness Bible, Taking Charge of Your Fertility by Toni Weschler. That's usually where most women start. And there's also a lot of other great books like Katie Singer's Garden of Fertility. That's another great resource for fertility awareness information. And in terms of apps, the most popular fertility awareness charting app is the Kindara app.
Right.
That's the most popular. There's lots and lots and lots of charting apps out there. And ultimately, if this interests you, it's kind of like go grab a book, buy a thermometer, and But what I would say is that if you're really serious about using this method for birth control, or if you find that after you start charting your menstrual cycles do not follow the normal parameters, and there's just there's signs of potential underlying issues, I would say that if you're really serious about using this method and getting the most out of it, it's most helpful if you work with somebody who can guide you through it. So when I learned how to chart, I actually was trained by women who knew how to chart. So I read Taking Charge of Your Fertility, and I started charting on my own, but ultimately I connected with women who were trained and experienced, and that really helped me to gain confidence. And that's why in my case, I've been, I'm 35 now. I started charting when I was like 18. So it's a long time. And I've always been able to use it successfully and confidently, but that was really because I was trained. Like, I know it's harder to learn on your own, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to understand those different signals. So you said the app Kindara, so Kindara is the app to check out. And also, so Lisa has a 3-part video series called Introduction to the Fertility Awareness. So it's FAM 101. And you can check it out at fertilityfriday.com/FAM 101. So that gives, do you want to talk briefly about the video series?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So I created a 3-part video series, especially if this is, if this is the first time you're hearing about the Fertility Awareness Method, or if it's fairly new to you, even if you've been kind of charting your cycles for a while. If you're looking to get more into what this is all about, how to identify the fertile window, I wanted to create a resource that kind of puts a lot of the stuff in one place, and also provides you with resources and information for really how to get started and how to get going with it. So fertilityfriday.com/FAM101, and I send a video out each day. So you'll get, over 3 days, you'll get 3 videos. And yeah, it's what I find is most women will say is just like, I can't believe no one taught me this in junior high school. Yeah. It's what I hear the absolute most. So what I found by doing this work is that it's just crazy that we're not taught about our bodies. Mm-hmm. It's like the most fundamental basic principles. So, I think of it as a movement. So join the movement. Let's start talking about our ovaries and stuff.
Awesome. Love it. Cervical mucus, fertile window. Let's do it. Yeah, awesome. Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast today. I appreciate all your words of wisdom and digging into the cycle for us. And thanks again, and have yourself a fabulous day.
Well, thanks so much, Sarah. It was my pleasure, and it was a lot of fun.
Hey there, Sarah Clark here. So are you struggling to have your baby? First of all, please know that my heart goes out to you. I support couples worldwide who are struggling with infertility to conceive and have healthy babies. Women like Rita, who gave birth to her beautiful daughter after following my fertility coaching system. Or Danielle, who after 2 failed IUIs was able to get pregnant after a Supercharger fertility discovery call with me. So here's how you get my help for free. So I offer a free Supercharger fertility discovery call. And on that call, I'll create a plan with you that is going to help you fast track your success. So this call is not for everyone. And I'm really picky about who I get to speak with. And I have a strict but totally reasonable criteria that needs to be met in order for us to move forward. So here's who I can help. So first of all, you need to be able to explore your infertility diagnosis in a new light. So this offers for people who are open-minded, they're coachable, and if you can do that and want to double or triple your chances at the fertility clinic or get pregnant, awesome. So let's get on the phone and chat. Also, you must be an action taker. So someone who's committed to seeing results, you're able to follow directions. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to do anything bizarre. But if you're one of those people who like to consume a ton of information, but don't like to spend time implementing and seeing results, then the call's not really for you. So I only want to spend time with people who are genuinely committed to their own success. So just click on the link in the show notes and apply, or go to fabfertile.com and click on the free consult. So it's a really short application that just tells me about your health, how long you've been trying to conceive, and how soon you'd like to be pregnant. So seriously, this is going to be the best time you've ever spent on your fertility. Looking forward to chatting. Talk soon. Thank you for listening to Get Pregnant Naturally. Seriously, it means the world to me that you're here. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can be notified of upcoming episodes. I'm excited to offer you a special gift. If you are a U.S. resident, text FERTILE, FERTILE, to 345345. You'll be prompted to enter your email address, and you will receive our 3-day free fertility diet challenge. The challenge includes delicious chef-prepared recipes that are specifically designed to enhance your fertility. Download the recipes and try them this weekend. For U.S. residents, text FERTILE, FERTILE, to 345-345. For non-U.S. residents, go to www.fertilitydietfreebie.com to access your special gift. That is Fertility Diet Freebie, FERTILITY, Diet, DIET, freebie, FREEBIE.com to access the 3-day free fertility diet challenge. And I love this quote by Dr. Mark Hyman. He's the medical director of the Cleveland Clinic Center for Functional Medicine and the chairman of the Institute for Functional Medicine. What you find at the end of your fork is more powerful than anything you'll find at the bottom of a pill bottle. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.